The tropical sun scorched the island of Guadalcanal, turning its dense jungles into a furnace of humidity and tension. Somewhere in a command tent, a group of Japanese officers leaned over maps and intelligence reports, sipping lukewarm tea and sharing a collective sense of superiority. The American war machine had arrived, they knew, but the latest reports brought a new subject of ridicule. The M4 Sherman tank. Slow, clumsy, weak, one officer scoffed, tossing the report onto the table. Another laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "It can't possibly make a difference in these dense jungles," he said, his confidence echoing through the tent like a drumbeat of arrogance. They called it a lumbering beast, incapable of matching the speed and precision of their finely tuned defenses. And yet, history often turns on the unexpected. The Sherman, in all its mechanical simplicity, was more than just a machine. It represented a shift in strategy, in thinking, and in the unassuming power of persistence. These were not the sleek, fast-moving tanks of legend. They were ordinary by design, but their true strength lay in numbers, reliability, and adaptability. And most importantly, they were operated by men who understood one thing better than arrogance ever could. The battlefield favors preparation and courage over assumptions. In those moments of laughter, the Japanese officers failed to see the most important variable: reality, unshaped by expectation. They could mock the machine, but they could not mock the ingenuity behind it, the logistical mastery, the industrial might of the United States, and the tactical patience of soldiers trained to leverage every advantage. What they saw as weakness would soon become a force that crushed lines, reshaped battles, and overturned the psychological certainty of victory. Across the island, hidden in the undergrowth, American crews inspected their tanks with quiet determination. These men understood the Sherman not as a glamorous weapon, but as a tool of survival, a calculated extension of strategy. Every rivet, every engine hum, every clank of treads on soil was part of a symphony that the laughing officers could not yet hear. The story of Guadalcanal is a story of misjudgment, of underestimating the underestimated, and of the transformative power of preparation. When arrogance meets reality, it is not the loudest voice that triumphs, but the one who adapts, persists, and acts with clarity under pressure. The laughter that echoed through the Japanese command tent would soon be replaced by alarm, confusion, and the realization that the world had changed around them. In the jungles of the Pacific, a simple tank would teach a profound lesson. The most dangerous opponent is not always the strongest, but the one whose potential you refuse to see. As the first Shermans rumbled forward, a new chapter in the war was about to begin. A chapter that would turn mocking smiles into stunned silence, and small machines into legends. In the dimly lit factories of Detroit and the heartlands of America, a different kind of battle was being waged, not on tropical islands, but on assembly lines where men and women worked tirelessly, welding, riveting, and testing the frames of what would become the iconic M4 Sherman tank. To the untrained eye, it was a modest machine, a 30-ton armored vehicle, a turret barely bristling with firepower, and a speed that could hardly inspire fear. On paper, it seemed almost ordinary, hardly the stuff of legends. Yet this ordinariness was deliberate. The American war effort faced a critical question. How do you tip the scales of a global conflict? The answer was not in creating a single supertank, capable of overwhelming any enemy in theory, but in producing thousands of tanks that could be deployed, repaired, and replaced faster than any adversary could respond. The Sherman was a steel gamble, a bet on scale, reliability, and logistical mastery. Engineers designed it with simplicity in mind. Its engine could run in harsh conditions. Its chassis could withstand repeated damage. Its parts could be swapped in the field by crews with minimal training. Every decision favored production speed over sheer might, versatility over spectacle. It was a machine built to endure the real conditions of war, not just impress in a textbook diagram. By the time the first Shermans rolled off the assembly lines, the United States had committed to a strategy that embraced quantity as a weapon. Tens of thousands of tanks would eventually be built, each one less glamorous than its German counterpart, each one lacking in raw firepower, but together forming an unstoppable tide. In war, numbers often speak louder than specifications, and the Sherman's true strength lay in its ability to appear wherever it was needed, again and again, without fail. For Japanese and German commanders watching intelligence reports, the Sherman seemed almost laughable. A clumsy American toy, they whispered. Yet behind the seemingly modest exterior was a harsh truth. No matter how fast or powerful an enemy's tank appeared on paper, sheer scale, reliability, and the foresight to produce thousands would eventually overwhelm them. The Sherman was more than steel and rivets. It was a statement about strategy itself. It reflected a philosophy that would echo across battlefields. The most effective power is often the one you do not notice at first glance, the one that quietly accumulates, adapts, and persists until it becomes unstoppable. And in that accumulation, the Americans had found an edge no mocking officer could foresee, a subtle, unstoppable force that would soon reshape the war. In the early days of the Pacific War, Japan's armored forces were a source of quiet pride. Light tanks, nimble and fast, had carried the weight of early victories across Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. On maps marked with Japanese flags, they seemed unstoppable, a symbol of strategy meeting execution in perfect harmony. Commanders and officers, emboldened by their successes, spoke with confidence that bordered on arrogance. They believed their tactics, honed against weaker opponents, could continue to dictate the rhythm of the war. But beneath this veneer of strength lay a troubling reality. Japanese tanks, though effective in rapid advances and jungle skirmishes, were lightly armored, underpowered, and increasingly vulnerable. Designed for mobility rather than endurance, they were ill-prepared for the evolving nature of the conflict. By 1942 and 1943, the industrial machine of the United States had begun to deliver weapons that were not necessarily superior in individual design, but overwhelming in numbers, reliability, and adaptability. What had worked brilliantly in small, swift campaigns now threatened to collapse under sustained pressure. The commander's confidence, once justified, had transformed into a fragile pride. Reports of American tanks were met with derision, not analysis. Intelligence about industrial capacity was dismissed. The laughter that echoed in Japanese command tents was not the sound of victory, it was the sound of denial. They failed to consider that their previous successes were conditional, dependent on opponents who could not match their logistical reach or sustained production, and yet, the illusion of invincibility persisted. Officers studied maps and drills, meticulously planning for encounters with what they thought were inferior machines. They believed their crew's skill, the agility of their light tanks, and the strategic use of terrain would secure another string of victories. But history has a way of testing assumptions. In the jungle, under relentless humidity and gunfire, confidence alone could not armor a tank, nor could pride compensate for firepower, reliability, and the sheer momentum of industrial production. By mid-1943, the cracks were becoming visible to those who looked beyond arrogance. Light tanks that had once breezed through defenses were now vulnerable to even modest American artillery. Speed could no longer compensate for lack of armor. Tactical ingenuity could not offset the overwhelming presence of machines designed not for brilliance in isolation, but for relentless, sustained pressure. This fragile confidence, nurtured by early victories, would soon meet its harshest test. When the Shermans arrived, it was not just a clash of steel. It was a confrontation between pride and reality, between misjudgment and preparation, between the fragile illusion of invincibility and the relentless logic of industrial warfare. The stage was set, and the laughter that had once filled the command tents was about to be replaced by confusion, fear, and the humbling force of machines that, in their unassuming reliability, carried the weight of an entire nation's resolve. In warfare, as in life, pride can blind even the most disciplined minds to the truths building quietly beneath the surface. And when it does, the consequences are rarely forgiving. The morning sun rose over Guadalcanal, its light slicing through a haze of smoke and mist. From the beaches the rumble began, low, steady, almost imperceptible at first, like distant thunder. Then one by one the silhouettes appeared, the M4 Sherman tanks, their treads cutting through sand, mud, and dense jungle, moving toward fortified positions that Japanese officers had deemed impenetrable. For the men entrenched in bunkers and foxholes, the sight was surreal. These machines were meant to be slow, unwieldy, and easily stopped by their defenses. Yet, with mechanical precision, the Shermans advanced, seemingly indifferent to the tangled undergrowth, the sharp coral ridges, and the hidden pitfalls of the islands. Each tank carried more than armor and guns. It carried a concept that the enemy had underestimated: relentless, adaptable force. On Tarawa and Saipan, the story repeated itself. Japanese garrisons, confident in their fortified positions, initially laughed at the approach of American steel. "They cannot maneuver here," they whispered, gesturing at cliffs, mangroves, and narrow passes. But laughter quickly turned to disbelief as tanks crushed barricades, overturned obstacles, and provided moving cover for infantry. The jungle and coral, once considered natural advantages, became a proving ground for ingenuity, training, and sheer mechanical persistence. The contrast was striking. On one side, pride, experience, and well-placed defenses. On the other, a machine underestimated for its modest appearance but powered by industrial scale, tactical foresight, and crews who had mastered both terrain and machine. The Shermans did not sprint across the battlefield. They methodically dismantled the illusions of invulnerability. One bunker, one wire fence, one entrenched machine gun nest at a time. It was not just physical destruction that marked their arrival. Psychological shock rippled through Japanese ranks. Officers who had once mocked reports now faced a reality they could not deny. This was not a single tank, but a tide of steel that would not falter. Terrain, tactics, and early victories, the pillars of their confidence, were being torn apart in real time. In those first hours, as explosions lit the canopy and dust mingled with smoke, the lesson became painfully clear. Underestimating an opponent, no matter how modest they appear, is a gamble rarely won. The Pacific Islands erupted not just in fire, but in revelation, a stark reminder that preparation, adaptability, and quiet perseverance often outweigh speed, strength, and superficial brilliance. And so, as the Shermans rolled forward, the battlefield was no longer merely a contest of men and machines. It had become a test of perception, of pride, and of the hard truth. In war, as in life, reality will always challenge expectation. In the shadowed canopies of Guadalcanal, the Sherman tank transformed from a simple machine into a force that seemed almost alive. Mud clung to its treads, thick and unyielding, yet it pressed forward without hesitation. Jungle ridges, once considered impassable by even the most daring infantry, became pathways for its advance. For the Japanese defenders, watching from concealed bunkers and hidden trenches, disbelief rippled through the ranks. These officers had expected lumbering machines to falter, to be bogged down, or to stall at the first serious obstacle. Instead, the Sherman rolled forward with a terrifying patience. It climbed ridges that soldiers struggled to ascend on foot, tore through barricades that had held lines for months, and bulldozed obstacles intended to halt an entire army. Each movement, each cannon blast, was a lesson in mechanical persistence and tactical ingenuity, a reminder that scale and preparation often outweigh raw power. The jungle itself seemed to conspire with the tank. Where infantry struggled against mud, roots, and hidden pitfalls, the Sherman's treads gripped relentlessly. Its engine's roar became the soundtrack of impending catastrophe, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Japanese soldiers, who had once mocked the machine as a clumsy toy, now faced the horrifying reality of its capabilities. Fear replaced laughter. Disbelief turned into urgent reassessment. And yet it was not merely brute force that made the Sherman effective. Its design allowed crews to adapt on the fly, using terrain to shield advances, coordinating with infantry to flush out defenders, and leveraging its cannon to dismantle bunkers that were impervious to foot soldiers. It was a machine that married simplicity with strategy, showing that effectiveness is often hidden in clever application rather than flashy design. For the Japanese defenders, each Sherman that emerged from the jungle was a nightmare come to life. A weapon once deemed inferior now dictated the pace and direction of battle. Positions that had seemed secure crumbled under methodical assault. Pride and preparation faltered against the persistent advance of what they had once dismissed. This transformation from laughable curiosity to unstoppable juggernaut was a defining moment in the Pacific Campaign. The Shermans did not simply destroy bunkers and obstacles. They shattered assumptions. They forced soldiers and commanders alike to confront a painful truth. Underestimating an opponent is a gamble that rarely ends in your favor. In the jungles of the Pacific, the laughable tank became a monster of strategy, a testament to the power of preparation, persistence, and the relentless application of force. What was once a subject of ridicule had become the axis upon which battles turned, a tangible reminder that the unseen strengths of the underestimated often carry the weight of history. The morning fog clung to the ridges of Saipan as Japanese tanks and infantry prepared to confront the incoming Shermans. Confident in their weapons and tactics, the defenders believed the light armor of the American tanks would shatter, under even minimal resistance. Cannons were loaded, machine guns primed, and soldiers crouched behind bunkers, certain that the clumsy American toys would crumble under a hail of fire. At first, there was a tense silence. Then the clash began. Shells whined through the air, striking the Sherman's armor, and simply bounced away. The tanks advanced steadily, impervious to the attacks that had once secured victory after victory for the Japanese. Mortars and light artillery, effective against infantry and lightly armored vehicles, now seemed almost impotent against the relentless steel of the Sherman. Every shot that glanced harmlessly off the tank's surface widened the gap between expectation and reality. Infantry attempted desperate maneuvers. Soldiers charged with explosives, hoping to disable the tanks by any means possible. Some sacrificed themselves in close-range attacks, but even the most courageous efforts barely slowed the armored juggernauts. Each advance, each calculated blast, reinforced a lesson the Japanese commanders had refused to acknowledge. The battlefield had changed. What once worked against lighter, slower machines now failed entirely against a combination of reliable engineering and tactical coordination. Shock replaced the initial confidence. Where laughter had once echoed through command posts, there was now a palpable fear, a recognition that old assumptions were no longer sufficient. The Sherman did not merely survive, it dictated the pace of combat, forcing defenders to react rather than control. The very rules of engagement had been rewritten. In the chaos of battle, it became clear. Overconfidence is a fragile shield. Relying on outdated weapons, honed against earlier, less prepared foes, proved disastrous against a foe that combined industrial might, training, and mechanical reliability. The Japanese defenders were forced to watch as a seemingly ordinary tank, underestimated and mocked, reshaped the very landscape of the fight. By the end of the day, the lesson was undeniable. The Sherman had transformed from an object of ridicule into a symbol of unstoppable adaptation. It demonstrated that firepower alone is not enough. The context of production, strategy, and foresight can amplify even modest designs into decisive forces. In the Pacific jungles, the battlefield had learned a new truth. Underestimate the underestimated at your peril, for the consequences can be both immediate and irreversible. Inside the belly of a Sherman tank, the world was a different place. It was cramped, stifling, and suffused with the smell of oil, sweat, and gunpowder. The roar of the engine was deafening, and the heat pressed against every surface like a second skin. For the young American tankers inside, fear was constant, a living, breathing companion that demanded acknowledgement. Yet it did not paralyze them. It sharpened their senses, forced clarity of thought, and fused them into a single unit capable of feats that a machine alone could never achieve. The Sherman, as formidable as it had become on the battlefield, was only part of the story. Its true power emerged from the men who operated it, from the coordination, trust, and courage that transformed steel into a force of strategy and precision. Each crew, driver, gunner, loader, and commander, was intimately connected, moving in a choreography that blended training, instinct, and improvisation. They read terrain, anticipated enemy maneuvers, and communicated silently through gestures, taps, and the subtle vibrations of the tank itself. In those moments, humanity and machinery were inseparable. Sweat streamed down faces, hands ached from relentless effort, and nerves frayed under the pressure of incoming fire. Yet the crews pressed on, navigating mud, ridges, and jungles that had once seemed insurmountable. Every bunker destroyed, every obstacle breached was the product of this delicate fusion of man and machine. The Sherman, powerful as it was, gained its real advantage from the courage multiplied across its crew. Without them, the tank was just a hunk of steel, an impressive but lifeless tool. For Japanese defenders observing from a distance, the human element went unnoticed. They saw only armor and guns, underestimating the intellect, teamwork, and perseverance driving the tanks forward. And yet, this human factor made all the difference. Decisions made in seconds, when to fire, when to maneuver, when to withdraw, determined the fate of both men and machines. Fear was transformed into focus, hesitation into decisive action. The Sherman, while laughable on paper, became unstoppable because of the humans who animated it. It is a lesson that transcends warfare. The most potent force is often the combination of human courage and structured collaboration. Technology alone can impress, intimidate, or destroy, but when paired with human insight, determination, and adaptability, it becomes extraordinary. The Sherman was a vehicle, but its legacy was written in the hearts, minds, and grit of the crews inside. In the jungles of the Pacific, amid smoke and the echo of cannon fire, a deeper truth emerged. Battles are not won by machines alone, but by the humans who dare to wield them. The Sherman may have been steel, but it was humanity that gave it life, and in doing so, rewrote what was possible on the battlefield. As the Pacific campaign unfolded, the pattern became undeniable. One island after another, Japanese defensive lines, once considered impregnable, began to crumble under the steady advance of the Sherman tank. Fortresses that had withstood months of preparation fell in days. Trenches and bunkers, meticulously designed for resilience, were breached with relentless precision. The machine that had once inspired laughter now carved a path of inevitability, leaving shattered defenses and stunned observers in its wake. Morale, the invisible yet crucial backbone of any army, eroded with every Sherman that rolled forward. Soldiers who had once trusted in terrain, tactics, and tradition now found themselves powerless against a combination of steel, strategy, and human ingenuity. Letters and reports from the front spoke of exhaustion, confusion, and disbelief. Officers who had once mocked the tank now faced grim assessments of losses they could neither understand nor immediately mitigate. Pride, long a pillar of confidence, gave way to a creeping awareness of vulnerability. The psychological impact extended beyond individual soldiers. Commanders, confronted with repeated failures, were forced to reassess not only tactics but also the very assumptions that had guided their strategies. What had worked against lighter, slower opponents now failed catastrophically. Japanese forces had relied on speed, cunning, and surprise, but these advantages could not withstand a persistent, adaptable enemy that combined industrial scale with disciplined execution. The Shermans were not just machines, they were vectors of a new kind of warfare, one where preparation, coordination, and relentless forward momentum trumped singular brilliance. Each victory reinforced the lesson. Underestimated forces can redefine the battlefield. The Sherman's advance was methodical, almost clinical. With every breach, it reshaped the landscape, forcing defenders to react rather than dictate. Positions once thought secure were exposed, lines once considered solid were fragmented, and the confidence of commanders was replaced by urgent recalculation. In this transformation, the tank transcended its mechanical nature, becoming a symbol of strategic inevitability. By the time Allied forces had swept through islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, the pattern was unmistakable. Repeated application of consistent, reliable force could achieve what individual heroics or superior design alone could not. The Sherman, in concert with its crews, had become the fulcrum upon which entire campaigns pivoted. The laughter that had once echoed through Japanese command tents was silenced. In its place came a sober recognition of a hard truth. When preparation meets perseverance, the underestimated becomes decisive. The Sherman had turned from a subject of ridicule into an agent of transformation, line by line, island by island, leaving an indelible mark not just on the terrain of the Pacific, but on the very understanding of what determines victory in war. From a distance, the smoke rising from the Pacific battlefields tells a story that numbers and maps cannot capture. It is a narrative of underestimation, of assumptions untested against the relentless reality of modern warfare. Japan's strategy, built on speed, pride, and lightly armored forces, had worked in the opening months of the war. But against the Sherman, it faltered catastrophically. The root of this failure was simple yet profound. Arrogance had blinded commanders to the power of pragmatism. The Americans, in contrast, had approached the problem with a different logic. The Sherman was not the fastest, nor the most heavily armed tank in existence. On paper, it was unremarkable. Yet its design reflected a philosophy of adaptability and resilience. It could be produced in massive numbers, repaired quickly, and deployed across the most unforgiving terrain. Its value did not lie in individual brilliance, but in its consistency, its reliability, and the disciplined human crews that drove it forward. Where pride had failed, pragmatism prevailed. Japanese forces, relying on outdated tactics and thin armor, had been successful against enemies who could not match their speed and cunning. But in a war increasingly defined by industrial capacity and coordinated strategy, these advantages were no longer sufficient. Each lightly armored tank that was destroyed, each defensive line breached, became a lesson written in steel and smoke. Assumptions about superiority can be lethal when reality refuses to conform. The battlefield punished overconfidence and rewarded adaptability. The Sherman, simple in design but multiplied by numbers and human ingenuity, illustrated a timeless principle. Success is not measured by brilliance alone, but by the ability to sustain, to endure, and to act decisively in conditions of uncertainty. For every officer who had laughed at reports of slow, clumsy tanks, there was now the bitter acknowledgement that their expectations had been catastrophically misaligned with reality. In the jungles, coral atolls, and ridges of the Pacific, the consequences were stark. American pragmatism, a commitment to what was good enough and abundantly available, proved more lethal than carefully honed pride. It reshaped not only individual battles but the strategic calculus of the entire theater. Underestimation, a seemingly minor cognitive failure, had multiplied into an operational catastrophe. From this analysis emerges a universal lesson. The most dangerous opponent is not always the one with the flashiest tools or the most aggressive tactics, but the one whose potential is ignored. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was a lesson etched in fire, mud, and steel. And in its wake, it left a truth as relevant today as it was in 1943. The battlefield favors those who plan, persist and adapt, and punishes those who let pride blind them to reality. The echoes of war linger long after the last shot is fired. And in the Pacific, those echoes carry a lesson that transcends maps and military manuals. The M4 Sherman, once the subject of ridicule, emerged as a symbol of what happens when persistence, preparation, and scale converge. It was not the most powerful tank, nor the fastest, nor the most glamorous, but in its simplicity lay a quiet, unstoppable strength. Across islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, the Sherman carved a path that reshaped not just the battlefield, but the strategic thinking of an empire. Fortresses that had seemed secure were torn apart, defensive lines fragmented, and morale shattered. Officers who had once laughed at reports of the clumsy American tank were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the adaptable, the prepared, and the persistent. The Sherman's legacy is inseparable from the men who operated it. Inside its steel frame, young crews endured heat, fear, and the constant threat of death, yet pressed on with focus and discipline. They transformed an ordinary machine into a force capable of extraordinary impact. It was a lesson in human ingenuity that courage, teamwork, and careful execution can elevate even the simplest tools into instruments of historical change. On a broader scale, the story of the Sherman illustrates a principle that extends far beyond war. In life, as on the battlefield, it is easy to overlook what appears ordinary. Pride and assumptions can blind us to hidden potential, while persistence and pragmatism quietly accumulate power. A single Sherman tank may have seemed unremarkable. Thousands of them, however, multiplied into a force capable of rewriting history. The ordinary, when applied with vision and consistency, becomes extraordinary. For Japan, the consequences were stark and enduring. Their reliance on outdated tactics, light armor, and overconfidence could not withstand the relentless advance of an underestimated opponent. For the United States and its allies, the Sherman represented a triumph of strategy over spectacle, of preparation over pride. It was a reminder that in war, as in life, the unseen forces, numbers, coordination, endurance, and human resolve often determine outcomes more than flashy superiority ever could. Today, the Sherman stands not just as a tank, but as a symbol of timeless truths. It teaches that victory is rarely won by brilliance alone, and that the overlooked, the underestimated, and the ordinary can wield transformative power. From laughter to legend, from mocked curiosity to decisive instrument of change, the Sherman story echoes across time. Never underestimate what appears simple, for when multiplied by scale, persistence, and courage, it can alter the course of history itself.